Hey, this is Matt Jones with the 218 Group. Appreciate you taking time to join us today. I am with Kim Griffith from Griffith Coaching. Hi, Kim. How are you?
Hey, Matt.
Thank you for being here with us today. Kim travels around the country and does a lot of coaching. Plus, she brings experience in working not only as a church planter and as a pastor, but also on conference staff. And so she's seen a lot of the different ins and outs of how all this works. And Kim, so thanks for taking time. And kind of my first thing, I know that you're currently talking with a lot of pastors. And you said you just had a group, I guess a Zoom call, conference call yesterday. So one of the things I was curious about is what are the type of things that you're hearing that are on pastors' minds specifically in regarding to the COVID-19 and the impact that it's having on their churches?
Well, it's certainly been interesting. Obviously, something that nobody expected, and so a lot of pastors have been scrambling to figure out how do they do church from a distance, and a lot of them have been really surprised by the response of their churches to connecting digitally.
Like in a good way, or the challenge of trying to do that?
Actually, mostly in a good way.
Good.
Their challenges have included, churches that weren't already set up for live streaming, suddenly figuring it out and figuring out how to connect with some of their older folks that weren't connected digitally. But for the most part, they're finding that their services are doubling or more online. I was talking to one church, they usually have about 110 in worship, and they had 500 on their live stream last Sunday.
Yeah, that's significant. So are these people that were already connected with the church in some way and are just now all able to join at the same time? Is it kind of like Easter?
To where like if everybody came at the same time.
Right. Is it that, or is there a feeling that they're actually connecting with people maybe in a different way than they've been able to before?
I think it's both and.
Okay.
I do think it is, we always joke, if everyone came at the same time, we'd have X number of people. Right. So they do have a lot of people from church all there at the same time. But another pastor was telling me he met a dozen new families via virtual worship, and he was able to connect with them.
That's amazing. So how was it? Just through their Facebook post? How did they find out how people learned that they were streaming and came to them, or?
Kind of a mixture. A lot of them were putting it out on their Facebook and all the different social media avenues, but they also found that their church members found it much easier to invite people to a virtual site than maybe to bring them to a church building. So, it's easy to send a link and say, hey, at 10 o'clock, my church is doing this virtual worship, and it's a very non-threatening way for a guest to visit.
So that is a really interesting wrinkle to this whole thing, because you and I have sat in some of the same conversations to where 80% of all church growth comes through personal invitation. But everybody wants to spend their money on the other 20%. To try and figure out, what is the return on mailers, what is the return on, social media investment, those kind of things. But that's really interesting that it's still a personal invitation issue.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, that still rings true, but I do think it's a little less threatening than maybe bringing somebody to the building.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that, of course, that's one of those things. I know that when I'm working with the church, I tell them if your members aren't inviting people, I know one of two things. Number one is either they're not excited about what's happening in the church, so they want to invite people, or the other is that they've aged and gotten to the point to where they're very static in their relationships, and they're not being intentional about meeting new people or expanding their circle of influence in order to meet people that they can invite. So that's interesting that social media is giving the members a safe way to invite people that maybe they can't in a face-to-face dynamic.
And I've had several pastors say that they will probably continue. Even if they hadn't been live streaming before, it's something that they definitely want to continue in the future. Yeah.
So let's talk about that a little bit. How many of those pastors were positioned already as far as technology goes? Because I know that's one of the barriers I've heard is a church saying, well, first of all, they're making a lot of assumptions about what all it takes to get online. But they're saying we don't have $30,000 to drop into cameras and lights and streaming technology and those kind of things, and so we can't do that. So what were your pastors already set up to do that, or the ones that had to jump through the hoops? What type of stuff did they choose to do to get themselves online?
Right. Now, some of them were already live streaming or doing Facebook Live on a regular basis. So for them, it wasn't a super difficult transition, but quite a few were not. And for them, it might have been some of, we don't have money for the equipment, we don't really know how to do it, so they hadn't ventured into that world. So now they just figured it out. And certainly some of them, are as simple as just, setting up the Facebook Live video in their living room and doing a devotion. And they've done different things. One pastor asked different members of their church to record some element of the worship service. Like one did a prayer, one read scripture, and then they put it all together and put the video out on Sunday. And then they had a virtual coffee hour on Zoom.
Huh. Okay, so the live part was actually the community interaction,
right,
and everything else was prepackaged.
Right. Which
is a little bit of an antithesis of almost how most pastors would typically think, because at least I hear them say that key of communication is the ability to see and interact with the congregation, and that's vital to them. So that's interesting. So that's one of the ways they're doing it. So what are a couple others?
Right. A lot of others are doing, the worship from their living room, or have gone into the sanctuary with just them and maybe a musician and somebody running the camera, of course staying 6 feet apart, but, but together, and then trying to figure out how to connect as they're doing that Facebook Live. How do we connect with the people? One pastor asked everybody who was watching to take a picture of their family while they were watching and then post it on their Facebook page, on the church Facebook page, so everybody could still see everybody's face.
Yeah. So it sounds like one of those keys they are looking for is interaction. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, I had somebody say that even people who were dead against Facebook for years and years and years have now joined Facebook, and that they will literally do anything in order to stay connected.
Wow. So they were going around and talking about that, did any of them, was there a consensus on which mode had been most effective for maintaining community, creating community during a worship experience?
Not really. I mean, most of it seemed to be, live streaming, Facebook Live type things, and then using Zoom for small groups, committee meetings, coffee hours. People are really utilizing Zoom connecting. Okay.
Yeah, I've seen some of that. And the other thing that I've seen, I don't know if any of you guys spoke to this, is keeping it scheduled in its normal slot. Like if that was a Tuesday night meeting at 6, then they still had it then. They weren't trying to do that, and their small groups would continue to meet. Was that a kind of a common conversation?
It wasn't common, but I did get the sense that a lot of them are sticking to a regular routine. In terms of small groups, some of them have doubled in size as well.
Wow. Okay.
Now that people are coming on Zoom. And even the committee meetings, I was talking to one pastor where some of the members have to drive an hour to come to a nighttime committee meeting. And so now they're doing it on Zoom. And that's another thing where they're like, we may just do this way in the future, because they're seeing the Zoom meeting as being effective and far more convenient for the committee members.
Yeah. I've been in quite a few Zoom meetings myself, and it's really interesting watching people as they adapt to that. And oftentimes what I see at the very beginning, it's like one person very carefully speaking and trying to wait their turns and all that kind of stuff. So the interaction, I would say that's one thing that's different for me, is just the group interaction with that. But I think as people become more online savvy, that maybe that'll speed up a little bit. So the churches that were already streaming, did they see much difference, or it was just kind of continuity for them as far as?
They still saw an increase.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's important to beef that up and to continue to work with that as well. Mm-hmm. What kind of concerns did they say they were hearing from their church members as far as their connection with the church or their concerns about the church?
I mean, certainly, some concerns about finances, of course.
Right.
A lot of churches were set up with online giving, so that was helpful. But there are churches that were dead against online giving that have decided that it's a good thing.
Yeah.
Suddenly set it up in the last 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And then, pastoral care, of course, when you can't be physically present.
Right. So how has that impacted? Is it a lot of phone calls, or because a lot of pastoral care is for people who may not be as tech-centric?
Yes, they are doing tons of phone calls.
Okay.
I had several pastors that said they've been on the phone all week with different people. But they also have been surprised at the willingness of the church members to step in and help stay connected with each other.
Wow.
So they've had a lot of, they've recruited some church members to do wellness calls with the older folks, and so they're taking turns calling different people.
Yeah.
Another church got a bunch of people to volunteer to write notes to everybody in the church directory. And so she had 27 church members volunteer.
Wow.
And so they split it up, and they want everybody to receive a note every week. So they're just kind of rotating quadrants of the list and taking turns writing notes just to keep connected.
Wow, that's a big undertaking. So so one might, because I'm a systems person, right, and a strategist, part of what I wonder in all this is we're reestablishing patterns and expectations as far as pastoral care, regular calls, notes, those kind of things. What does life after coronavirus look like in the church?
Yeah.
Does everything just settle back to how it is? Expectations? Do our members expect not to get a call every couple of days from the pastor and not get a note every week? Or are we establishing new norms? What's kind of your sense on that?
I feel like it's kind of a combination. I think it depends on how long this goes. I do think, the longer we're apart and doing things virtually, the more likely we set into some new patterns that are going to be harder to break.
Yeah.
I think if we can continue to encourage the congregation connecting and feeling responsible for helping the pastor connect with one another and continuing to build on that would be great.
Yeah.
I do think I hear from pastors that yes, we want to continue to do things virtually now that we've discovered how effective it can be.
Right.
On the flip side, I also think that once we're finally able to be back together in person, there is going to be a hunger for some of that human connection that hopefully we'll see some of the benefit in worship, that people are going to be hungry to be back together.
You mentioned the length of this, and that's the big wild card. And we just here in Alabama, we just had our governor come on and say that no groups 10 or more through April 17th. I also imagine there's a lot of pastors going, great, we'll start meeting again the very following Sunday. But I don't think that's going to be the case. And as I talk to some older members, it's probably going to be a long delay before they are comfortable moving back into those close physical communities with things. So this is going to be a long delay.
Right.
So I remember we went through 2008, which was the economic downturn, and that was different in that the churches weren't shut down.
Right.
The churches were still functioning, but what happened was that money was tight, and we saw people who had been those regular attenders at church decide that instead of going on a vacation, which was expensive, they would just take long weekends.
Right.
And they discovered through taking those long weekends that number one was it was kind of fun not to be at church, because there's other things going on, which a lot of people in the world look around going, we've been telling you, there's other things to do. And then the other part was that the church continued to function even though they weren't there.
Right.
And I remember, I think it was in one of Jim's seminars early on, that he was stressing that the competition for churches on Sunday morning is not other churches. It's the golf course. It's now it's travel sports, and he just went down this long list. And for me, that was one of those eye-opening moments where oftentimes in church world we do think about in terms of what is this church or that church doing, but the reality is we're not competing with churches; we're competing with other opportunities. And so their patterns changed after that. And I can't help but wonder, as we get to the other side of this, exactly what you said, is people are going to have reestablished expectations and norms in their life. How different is it going to be? And as you talk to pastors, did you get a sense of how many of them were looking towards getting back to normal versus adopting a new normal, or are they still kind of in the land in between on that?
I think they're definitely in between, but I would get the sense that already, and we're only a couple of weeks into this, already they are thinking that there's going to be a new normal. Okay. I mean, they're going to keep having an online option. They're going to continue to do some things, small groups, meetings, have that option out there. So, I do think that's already changed.
Yeah.
I think it'll be interesting to see, right now we see double worship attendance on Sunday morning because it's online.
Yeah.
But we're 2 weeks in and people are really afraid of what's happening.
Right.
4 weeks from now, is it still going to be that same, 500 versus 100? And are people going to get into the habit because they can't travel and they can't do sports and they can't do, are they going to get more in the habit of going to church on Sunday morning online? And will that
right, because of the things that we compete with aren't happening. Right. So there isn't a whole lot to do. And that's I think a really deeper question, because I know, like you, as you're watching on Facebook and working through this, you're just seeing all these families who are doing things together that haven't been doing. There's all these great things emerging as far as community and connection and relationship. And I'm wondering, when we get to the other side of this, how quickly people are going to go back to those other things, or if they're going to try and reintegrate some of these positive things in life. I'm hoping that we're able to grab the positive and incorporate that and take from the past what was positive and continue to move on with that. So do you think churches are going to be now more intentional about having somebody on staff that actually understands tech and online community?
Oh, absolutely. I think if they have that person has earned their weight in gold in the last couple of weeks, if they hadn't already. And certainly going forward, if a church can afford it or tap a volunteer, they're going to have somebody who's going to be managing the technology, because I think even the church members are going to be like, we need to capitalize on what we've learned here.
Yeah.
I don't need to drive in for a finance meeting when we can talk for 45 minutes on Zoom and I can still have dinner with my family.
So I know you've had some other things that you've kind of heard and been around during this. So what else do you think is important for people to know right now?
I do think it's important that pastors recognize that they still have to take care of themselves and have boundaries. As we've been talking, people are like, yes, we've been home, but I've been working more than even in previous weeks.
Right.
And because they're working from home and they're doing phone calls and they're doing online and technology, they can do it at any time, all day, every night.
Yeah.
And so while we talked so much before about boundaries and making sure you take your time off and go home and spend time in this new normal that we have right now, establishing those new boundaries and shutting things down and intentionally saying, I'm not working this evening, or I'm not working for the next hour, and taking care of themselves.
Yeah, that's huge. That's a huge insight, because pastors are notoriously horrible at taking care of themselves.
Right.
Because we go into the ministry with the idea of making personal sacrifice for a lot of things, and so that we let that just carry over into other things. And the other thing that I've worried about in all this that you just touched on is our pastors are often good at responding to short-term crises. Like they live in that, right? I mean, It's that sense of run at a speed to where you've got just a little bit reserve left, to where when you've got everything going, but all of a sudden there's a death or something else, that you can respond to that. They're not really equipped to deal with long-term crisis. And I watched that in a couple of times, Hurricane Katrina and the aftermath of that, all that, I kind of saw a lot of that. So what are some things that you would encourage pastors to do to establish some of those boundaries and to be able to navigate kind of the long intensity of this shift in what church is and availability?
There are pastors who are doing like a daily Facebook devotional for their people at noon every day. Okay, great. So when you're doing what, you do phone calls, do this and that, but still have, at 5 o'clock, I'm stopping working. I'm having dinner with my family. I'm not going to be doing all of the things that I could continue to do all evening. So have kind of a regular routine and when you're going to stop, and take a day off. It's no different than when you're serving during normal time. A lot of pastors aren't good at taking days off.
Right.
It's because now they're part of this stress. We're all anxious right now. It's going to be even more important for them to take a day away from everything and just take time for themselves, take time for their families.
Yeah. And that last part in particular, take time for their families. This is the Achilles heel of pastors for generations, has been that pastors are so busy taking care of other people's families that their own feels neglected. And don't lose sight that you got people in your own house that are feeling the same stress as all these other families.
Right.
And kind of going through that one with it. So I think that's very, very wise insight. So you as a church consultant, you're normally traveling, you're flying around the country and this kind of thing. So how are you adapting? And if somebody had questions for you or wanted to contact you to follow up on something, what would be the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Yes, we are usually on the road about 80 to 90% of the time. So this is the longest we've been in our house since we bought it, like 8 years ago.
Wow.
So so I'm just here. We are doing a lot of coaching and Zoom calls from here. Obviously,
Okay.
we've had to cancel all of the in-person things and reschedule those for the fall.
Right.
If you want to reach out to me, I'm always happy to talk with people. It's just kim@griffithcoaching.com.
Okay. And we'll put that up on the screen here for people so they can get that as well. Now, and so tell me about the new thing you're doing. You and I briefly talked about this the other day, but
Right.
it's an important area that you're moving into, and it's a great resources for churches, as I think. So talk about that just a little bit.
It's called Looking Glass. And we talk about the more you know, the more you see. The more you know about yourself and the more you know about the people you're working with, the more you see and the more you understand. And so I use StrengthsFinder or DISC assessments to help individuals and teams understand their strengths and their leadership style.
Okay, good stuff, because pastors are not always the most self-aware people. So those are both really good tools to do that. And I know that you do come from a strengths-based approach to that, where, a lot of times in our culture, we focus on what we're not good at, and we get caught up in that. And so we want to work on our weaknesses. You can only do that so long.
Yeah, and it doesn't really help.
Yeah.
I mean, you are wired how you're wired. So
Yeah.
building on who you are and what your strengths are, and then figuring out how to use those strengths to compensate for things you're less strong in is a lot more productive than trying to become something that you're not.
Yeah, well, good stuff. Well, I'm glad you're moving into that area as well. So hopefully all that will taking off. Hopefully, eventually, you'll be out doing all of these things again. But you, like
Right.
churches, are adapting to being able to do things online too. So you're even available now to work on some of that stuff if people want to get in touch with you while they got a little bit downtime. So, but thank you for taking your time. I know that you are busy and managing a lot of calls and interviews and those kind of things. So thank you for taking time to be with us today. And for those of you who are watching, I thank you for taking your time to watch us and to tune into this. If you found this to be helpful, we ask that you like and follow our page and even share it with some other friends that may find this information to be helpful for them as they navigate through this very unique time in the history of the church.